Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Teachers Retirement System Investment Meeting for March 7th, 2019. Patricia, would you please call the roll?
John Adams.
I am here.
Thomas Brown.
Here.
David Kazansky.
Present.
Lindsay Oates. Deborah Penny.
Here.
Susanna Vickers.
Here.
Thank you so much. All right, we'll commence our public agenda, and I'll turn it over to Rokaton to run through our reports.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
The first item on the agenda was a review of the fourth quarter 2018 performance. I know we covered that off in more detail at the last meeting, so I wasn't planning to flip pages or go through the book that we handed out, but happy to answer any questions that anyone had on that.
Any questions for Mike on the fourth quarter? I think the less said about the fourth quarter the better.
I concur.
Kid.
And I'd much rather talk about January anyway.
Yep.
So then maybe we'll switch gears and we'll dive into January 2019. At the end of January, we saw the Diversified Equity Fund with assets of about $14 billion. You'll recall that was quite a strong month across markets. In the U.S., the Russell 3000 was up about 8.6%. Abroad, your international composite benchmark, which is comprised of both developed and emerging markets, that benchmark was up about 6.7%. So it was a nice rebound across the board compared to what we saw in the fourth quarter. The Diversified Equity Fund in total was up about 8.2%, ahead of the hybrid benchmark of about just 8%. The Balanced Fund with assets of just shy of $400 million, that fund was up about 2.6%. The International Equity Fund, roughly in line with the International Composite Benchmark, and a return of about 6.7%. The Inflation Protection Fund, up about 4.4%, largely in line with its benchmark. And lastly, but not least, the Socially Responsive Equity Fund with assets of about $213 million. That fund was up about 7.5%, just behind the S&P, which was up about 8%. So it was a pretty strong month to kick off the year. And then as we look into February, there's a separate handout for that. The Russell 3 continued to do quite well. Russell 3000 was up about 3.5% during February. Calendar year to date, the Russell 3 is up over 12%. The Diversified Equity Fund's hybrid benchmark was still up about 3.2%. So non-US lagged US a little bit over the first 2 months of the year. The EFI index was up about 2.6%, bringing its year-to-date return to just over 9%. The emerging markets during the month of February were down modestly to the tune of about 1%. Year-to-date still positive by about 6%. So all told, we continue to see positive returns through February. The underlying strategy for the Inflation Protection Fund was up about 1% in February. Year-to-date, that fund's up over 5%. And the Socially Responsive Equity Fund's underlying strategy up about 3.3% in February, bringing its calendar year-to-date to just over 11%. So I will pause there. Stop.
I have one question, which you may not be able to answer, but it just strikes me as strange. So, at the end of January, the Russell 3 for 1 year was down 2.25.
Yeah.
And after going up a month by 3.5% in the month of February, the 1 year is then 5.05. I guess that's because the month of February from a year before you knock out the month of January.
You lose that month and gain another month.
Right, that's what happened, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
And if you have dramatic months, it can really move the 12-month number.
Right. Just trying to figure that out in my head. Yeah. Okay. It takes me my head a while to figure things out.
I mean, if you look at actually, well, no, I was going to say the 5-year number. The 5-year number is roughly the same, about 30 basis points different, over 10%.
Yeah.
So for 5 years, still a very compelling return, despite 2018.
We've seen a little more volatility the last week or so. there's been some more press around slowing growth in the U.S., trade deficits, and other topics that we think will potentially weigh on the markets over the next few months. But we'll continue to report back.
Okay, any other questions for Rokitan? Okay. So that's it for the performance report, right?
Yes.
So we're going to move into the investment policy statement discussion.
Sure. And there are many people around the table who have been very involved in leading the development of this new draft. I think I've been volunteered to start the discussion, but I shouldn't by no means control the discussion because, as I said, there's a working group that was devoted to spending a lot of time on this, and so Valerie, Suzanne, and John and others should definitely pipe in. So there are a couple of overarching comments I'd like to make, and we have copies of the body of the new draft. We also emailed you the body as well as the appendices. We chose not to make copies of the appendices in effort to not have an impact on climate change. So a couple of comments. First, we don't expect that everyone on the board has had the opportunity to read every word of this, but we understand this will be an iterative process. We'd like to start the dialogue today. We also wanted to note that what we tried to do was to take, and believe it or not, I have been carrying this around for months now. We wanted to take the most recently approved draft of the IPS, yes, and accomplish a few things. First, and most importantly, bring it up to date with policies and practices that the board has adopted. Secondly, make it more user-friendly, so therefore organize it more tightly, make it more succinct. And third, take those items which are most likely to be dynamic or subject to periodic change, like, for example, the annual implementation plans, and move those to the appendices and isolate within the main body of the document those policies and practices and statements that are less likely to be changed. This recognizing, however, that everything in this document should be reviewed periodically. We talk about in the document this being reviewed not less often than every 3 years. So it should at least be a triennial practice. And but we wanted the main body of the document to be less vulnerable to changes. The final point I'd make is that we also wanted to incorporate basic principles and investment beliefs that we think reflect the board's values and priorities in the introduction and preface to this document. And although those were spread around the prior document, I think we've really done a pretty good job in summarizing upfront what the beliefs and principles that the board uses in all of its decision making. Of course, the investment beliefs were not in the prior statement because they didn't exist in a formal state. So with that, I'm just going to, unless anyone has questions or wants to approach this in a different way, I was planning to just walk through this document fairly quickly. Now I have to get my version of it. Fairly quickly and highlight what has changed. And again, this is the board's discussion, and so we're happy to deal with it in any way that you see fit. Yeah, I really need mine with my notes. I can't remember everything.
And
Yes.
I would,
Please go ahead.
if I could add, I think we initially started wanting to do kind of a side-by-side comparison of where we could go in the current document, but it's been through so many changes and edits, it would be impossible to kind of do a side-by-side. So I just encourage everybody to look at it, you know, in a way, as I think like a standalone document, you know, and understanding and, you know, trying to see whether you agree with the concept of the way that it's organized. And then if we have specific questions or points about different aspects of it, we can go back to the original IPS, but just it would be we would be unable to provide you with a side-by-side at this point because of all the changes. It's apples and kumquats by now.
Right. Although I will say, in many cases, we use the same exact language. So it's not as though we rewrote every word of this document. Where possible, we tried to use the existing language. But there were many places in which we condensed portions of the document, moved it around, and so a red line would be just a sea of red. So if we could start just with the table of contents, let me point out a couple of things. One is that the executive summary, the preface is new. And the purpose and principles section is reorganized. So I think it's important to note that there was never an executive summary and there did not exist a statement of beliefs in this document previously. So with that, we can start walking through. So the statement of investment, obviously the summary is on page 4. The statement of investment beliefs, which is simply the document that's already been reviewed and approved by the board, is on page 5. And
Let me
then
just point one little minor thing out, which is that
yeah.
once this is not in tracked changes, the print will be larger and not so the eyes of those of us who are, you know, at a certain age. And therefore, I think the statement of investment beliefs will still fit on one page. I know that was
Very
an
important.
objection. What's that?
Very important.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. So starting on page 6, we have the purpose of the investment policy statement. And again, a lot of this language existed elsewhere. Most of this language has existed elsewhere in the document. We've reorganized it in part to just make it more succinct and to flow better. Then on page 7, we have investment policy roles. That this general language existed in the prior document. We've reviewed all of it and made some modifications, again, to reflect updated practices and, again, to remove redundancies.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah. No, this is not interruption.
Okay. So
We should all talk.
I'll just add that what everybody's looking at is the most recent draft, and so there are still some notes, you know, that the committee was going back and forth on. So there was a question about this bullet at the bottom of page 8, and so Diane, who has been working on some of this, just wrote confirmed. So all that is there was a little bit of back and forth, and you'll see some a few, I think, open topics as we go through.
And there's one topic in particular that we
Yes.
want to bring up.
Yeah.
So you see all the responsibilities and roles that goes through to page 10, where we start talking about the roles and responsibilities of service providers. Again, this type of language and existed in the original document. We've made some wording changes, tried to condense and be more succinct. And then if we turn to page 13, we start talking about eligible investments, where again, we're really trying to be more succinct. And on page 14, you can see on the second bullet, we add an appendix, which is the divestment policy, which I don't believe, did the divestment policy exist in the prior document?
It did not.
No,
It did not.
it's a
We only
new,
adopted
New
it.
document.
The board passed last year.
Right. When you go to section 5 for investment
Page 14,
objective,
but
that,
the policy itself is not here.
if you go, is there,
Yeah,
John, did you
I'm
want?
sorry, no, I just answered
Okay.
the question. Sure.
So on page 14, section 5, investment objective, these are the same identical words that existed in the prior document. So where possible, where we thought the language was succinct and accurate, we kept it. Then we have asset allocation and rebalancing, And if you turn to page 15, I want to point to the second paragraph on page 15, where we refer to the most recently approved long-term strategic allocation targets, as well as rebalancing ranges and parking places. In the prior document, these were listed in the body of the IPS. In this version, this is an example of something that is likely to change when we do our periodic asset allocation studies. And so this is I think a very good example of something we removed to an appendix. So this is now Appendix 1. So the information can still be found, but because it's information that's likely to change every few years, we want to put it in an appendix.
Robin, one question.
Yes.
For these things, I know when we do other IPSs sometimes, should we say an as of, that way in case there is a mistake, like let's say there is an updated policy and it doesn't get added into this document, like updated, it's just clear that this is as of this date. That way we won't.
Would you put that in the appendix? Where would you put that?
You can put it almost anywhere. It could be a catch-all.
Yeah,
But it's just sort of a protective item.
But isn't that on the cover?
Yes.
Right, but
That, and we'll have a document that kind of memorializes all changes, so I think
Okay,
when
that's
we
fine.
get to the.
and I apologize, I'm not trying to take us on a tangent. I just know people sometimes miss some of these things, and we have so much here.
Right.
Every-
Yes, and
it's very
Appendix
diligent.
13 is the IPS modification table.
We'll have a modification.
Right.
Okay.
We'll track any
Okay,
changes.
sorry, then I will stop. I
Yeah,
apologize.
no, and
We're on.
that's fine, point to make.
The table is the last thing we're going to include
Okay,
Yeah,
good
that's
enough.
to make all the changes.
Sorry, just paranoid
No,
from seeing
that's
people
good.
miss it before.
It's important.
Periodic review of the document,
Every 3 years, a minimum of every 3 years.
so we just have to make sure that we do it every 3 years.
Correct,
Because
and
I mean,
every 3
there was
years.
a longer amount of time between 2006 and 2000. So every 3 years we should look at it.
Agreed.
Yes, yes, we should absolutely make sure we do that every 3 years.
Which probably
At least
means,
won't be
given how
as big a
long this
deal.
one has taken, we should start like
Start
next
now.
month.
The idea was that this one is
We
in
all
such
need
a
a
great
little hiatus.
format. We did a whole revamp, so the next time it gets modified, it should be
A lot easier.
Yes.
strategic,
Right.
yes, easy.
And
Yes.
if we do it every 3 years, it won't be as big a job.
Yeah.
Yes, quite as big an undertaking. So the next section on page 15 is guidelines. And again, there was a guideline section. We made this, I think, more robust by organizing it so that we took relevant language from other parts of the IPS and organized it under guidelines. But it was here previously. Now, we want to talk about this edit on the side of page 15. And would you like to take that one?
Sure, and please jump in. So basically, what this is, and there's sort of a similar thought on page 17. There are various limitations within current asset class IPSs in terms of the maximum level of exposure to a particular manager or within a particular fund. And BAM's point of view is that those limitations should be looked at to make sure that they still make sense. And so we've indicated what the current manager on this page, manager limitations are, and we're requesting an increase, if it makes sense, to 20% from the current levels. And this idea has been vetted with consultants, I think both the general consultant and the asset class consultants as well. And there's, I think agreement around the idea of increasing those levels based on the current market size, a survey of other pension funds. We think that increasing from sort of the current 10 or 15% to 20% might be prudent.
And you think that makes sense across the board, that going from 10 to 20 is just as reasonable as going from 15 to 20?
Well, yes, in private asset classes, Infrastructure, for example, is the only one that's currently at 10. And I think that was because, sort of as a new or young asset class, people weren't sure of what the market size or what the funds would look like. And so it's not just, it makes the same amount of sense to go from 10 to 20 as 15 to 20. It makes sense for infrastructure to be at 20.
Honestly, I want more information before I think that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
to me,
fine.
what you just said doesn't make sense to me, because you would think a new asset class, when you're just building it up and you don't have that many managers, you would accept a higher limit, but as you become more diversified. So anyway, I'd like to see what what we have now, what the exposures are, and I think I would like a written recommendation from each of the asset class consultants about why they think that 20% is prudent. So, because to me, it's especially on infrastructure where you're doubling it.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't expect it to be decided today.
Yeah, no, I know, but I'm making that request.
So perhaps at the next meeting, we could follow that up, this up?
So I'd just say for purposes of this IPS, it wasn't an idea that you would vote on this today either, but if the IPS moves more quickly than discussion and approval by the board of any changes here, the IPS would reflect the current limits, and not until you voted on changing those limits would they be incorporated into the IPS. So
It makes me, actually, it makes me wonder, given that, and given that we might reconsider it in the future, whether we should move that to the appendix.
Well, that is
I'm
who's
thinking,
talking.
but actually, what makes sense is to move it to the appendix for each of the asset classes that we're discussing here, as opposed to having it be a general guideline. Again, we're getting into committee trivia here, or trivia is not the right word, but detail. So, but that's just a thought.
Okay.
Because then we wouldn't have to wait on that.
We could put it in the description of asset classes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Isn't the appendix?
Yeah, that's in the appendix,
Right.
yeah.
Each asset class is going to have its own section in the appendix. And these limitations could be included in.
Well, I don't think they'll be in one appendix, right? All the
Right.
asset class descriptions.
They're on paragraphs.
Sections with.
Subsections.
Within the appendix.
Now you have a window into our working group conversations.
And
Right, it's appendix 2, approved asset classes,
Yes.
right?
On page 16, we have TRS Investment Policy Restrictions, which I believe is a new section. But a lot of the language was taken from elsewhere in the original document. Liquidity is exactly the same as it was in the prior document. And then we talk about investment classes here. And we've really made this much more succinct, because we're going to have detailed discussions and descriptions of each asset class and our objectives for that asset class in the appendix. You see the same, as this was pointed out, you see the same comment on page 17 regarding manager allocations. And I for one, do think it's a good idea to put that in the appendix. Right. So then we talk about investment manager selection. Of course, that on page 18, that was included in the original IPS, but we've summarized it here to refer to the process rather than describe the detailed process. Brokerage is almost identical to the prior document. And then we turn to page 19, which is performance monitoring and evaluation. And you see that we, for example, under policy benchmark item 1, in the prior document, we listed all of the asset classes and benchmarks that were in the policy benchmark, and it took up a couple of pages. And here we're just saying it's in appendix 1. There is a policy benchmark, it's in appendix 1, and the policy benchmark will change every time we change the asset allocation policy. On page 20, we have a discussion of risk management, and this is an example of where where there was a discussion of risk management in the prior document, we updated the language, in this case, to reflect the fact that there's a risk management unit in BAM. And there was no reference to a risk management unit. I'm not sure there was a formal risk management unit.
Wasn't one to
previously.
reference.
Yeah, it didn't exist. So that's an example of how the language is changed to reflect new policies and practices. But portfolio transitions, not a word was changed in this section. Securities lending, virtually identical language, the prior document. Securities litigation protocol, no change except a number of an appendix that we refer to. Investment expenses, no change here. And then corporate governance, what we've done here is just reorganize some descriptions and language that were scattered throughout the prior document. I think we have provided on page 22 more detail about how the Office of the Controller executes your corporate governance policies. PRI, same language that was in the prior document, it was in the appendix to the prior document. And
I'm sorry, can I just go back to
Yes.
corporate governance for a minute?
yes,
Is the corporate governance policy an appendix? It's not, I don't think. I think
Proxy voting guidelines.
proxy voting guidelines, there you go.
Yeah,
Appendix
appendix
9,
nine.
thank you. Okay. Because that does get revised almost annually, some kind of update. Yeah. Okay, thank you, sorry.
That's
Sorry,
okay.
pardon the interruption.
and I did notice on page 23 we have PRI as a separate section. We also discussed it on page 22, so we might want to think about whether that's a redundancy.
Yeah,
Oh, section 20.
Yeah,
yeah, it is.
it's its own section, and yet we have section 18, 19B, 18, 19.
Yeah,
So-
and one refers to appendix 9 and the other refers to appendix 10. Anyway, whoops.
Yeah, we need to,
Yeah.
okay. And, so, the only last thing I want to note is that under appendices, you see appendix 2 is approved asset classes. In the prior document, that took up exhibits 2 through 10. So we really, so every asset class had its own language, and there was a lot of repetition and redundancy. So we really, again, tried to make this much more concise.
Also, didn't we agree that we're gonna switch the numbering to put the divestment policy, restrictions on permissible investments, and excluded companies list together? Didn't we, at the
Yeah.
last committee meeting?
Yeah, yes, I think we did talk about that, yes.
So there'll be some renumbering.
Yeah.
There may be a number, I don't,
They'll be separate, just the
Were we
numbers
gonna
are
move it
together,
to
right?
group it with the excluded companies list?
I actually don't recall that, but,
We can talk about it.
We'll talk
Okay.
about
Just-
it.
Okay.
So there's still a lot of formatting that needs to be done, but it's, I think, a lot of effort has been put into making it readable. And so I think, there might be some little touch-ups that are always gonna appear to us at the end.
So we'll review this again, and the review really is to see if there are more opportunities for streamlining, making the document more concise, that the appendices make sense, they're ordered correctly, and that the document doesn't reflect any substantive changes unless those changes are specifically brought to and approved by the board. So I think between now, maybe now and the next meeting, we'll probably have another call. And then the next document you see would be a red line against this. Yes?
Whatever you want.
I think that might make sense, but again, understand the parameters that we're working under, which is that no substantive changes to the board's current policy. It's
Yeah,
all
so I think that's a
streamlined.
really important point to emphasize. None of the policies or practices that have been approved by the board are changed in this document.
Except for that limitation.
Right, well, that hasn't been changed, we're suggesting a change,
Yeah.
but it
That has
hasn't
not
been
been
changed
changed.
yet.
And I would ask the trustees that weren't on the committee, because we've been living with this document for quite a while, so when we read it, we see what we want to read. If you're reading something that you go, wait, that doesn't make any sense, or this is, it's inconsistent, our feelings will not be hurt with you saying, hey, we noticed this, because that's kind of what.
Absolutely.
We've had discussions about prepositions. We can do anything.
I mean, I just want to say, just at a cursory glance, it's leaps and bounds better than it was in its previous War and Peace volume style. And I know you guys are kind of in mile 25 of a marathon, so you're kind of getting to the end. But the work that's been done on this on all sides has been really impressive. And we're very happy with the progress that's been made on this so far.
Thank you.
Let me just say that the first probably 15 or 16 miles of that marathon for our office were run by Antonio Rodriguez prior to his switch. So I just want to credit him for carrying that. What do you call the thing in the relay?
The baton.
The baton. Thank you for carrying that baton before he turned it over to others in the office.
So he only did half.
Well, I think we did about 15 or 16 of the miles myself, but maybe 18 or 20. I don't know. Yeah.
Great, so the plan is to have another working group call before the next meeting, produce a red line for the board at the next meeting?
Sounds great.
I think so.
Okay.
And then incorporate any comments or questions from the other trustees in the
sure.
meantime. If
To
we
the
get
extent you have any, do that.
You can't sleep.
Okay,
All right,
so does that conclude our public agenda, I think?
I believe so.
Okay, so with that, a motion would be in order to enter executive session.
Oh, of course. I move pursuant to Public Officers Law, Section 105, to go into executive session for discussions on specific investment and contract matters.
Thank you, Deb. Is there a second?
Second?
Thank you, Dave. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to exit public session and enter executive session, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. Okay, Susan, would you report out of executive session, please?
In executive session, a recommendation on allocations for 2 existing managers and 1 new manager in the Diversified Equity Fund was received and discussed. Consensus was reached, which will be announced at the appropriate time. A presentation regarding a transaction involving a service provider was presented and discussed. A vote was taken, the results of which will be announced at the appropriate time. An exception to an investment guideline was discussed. Consensus was reached, which will be announced at the appropriate time.
Thank you so much. I believe that concludes our business for today. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you, Tom. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Susanna. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to adjourn, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. The meeting is adjourned.